It is an hour.
So,
I'm good with 25. You're just gonna not, no, I'm not, just change it last now.
you want to go last?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're supposed to go first. I'm supposed to go last.
Simon, Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for coming. During this session, we would like to discuss the utilization of new voting technology to empower a private and independent vote across the United States while appreciating security concerns. People with disabilities face various challenges and barriers when it comes to voting, from accessible election websites to physical access to polling places. We must do better. It's important that we continue research and development on voting technology and the advancement of innovative programs, including piloting assisted technology to help voters with disabilities. Harnessing technology in a secure manner will bolster the accessibility promise of the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. It is my hope that we hear both accessible and security and technology advances from our distinguished panel. And first, I would like to thank the EAC staff that put this together, particularly Pat Leahy and Mona Harrington. Because these forums are not easy to bring together in such a short amount of time. I will introduce our panel in the order in which they will speak. First will be Kelly Buckland, Executive Director for the National Council on Independent Living. Next will be to my right, Diane Golden, Project Director, the Illinois Assisted Technology Program, and an EAC Technical Guidelines Development Committee member. Next will be Alice Miller, Executive Director for the District of Columbia. And last but not least, former EAC Commissioner, but now Senior Cybersecurity Advisor for the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA, at the Department of Homeland Security, Matt Masterson. And with that, Kelly.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. And welcome, and it's nice to be here with you all. It's good to see some friendly faces in the audience. For those of you who do not know me, I am Kelly Buckland. I'm the Director of the National Council on Independent Living. We are a membership organization for Centers for Independent Living and statewide independent living councils, which are nonprofit, non-residential organizations that are run by people with disabilities and serve people with disabilities. There's about 700 centers for independent living across the country, and there's 56 statewide independent living councils, one in each state and territory, meaning there's one here in DC, and those organizations are appointed by the governor of the state or territory. So with that, we have been very involved in election kinds of stuff, everything surrounding it, because there are a whole host of barriers that face people with disabilities when it comes to voting. I have voted since 1972. I'm not quite as old as Doug, but I'm getting there really quick. So my first vote was for Richard M. Nixon, who we all know how that turned out. So, and I have taken my right to vote very seriously ever since then. So when I turned 18, I thought that my responsibility and my right to vote was incredibly important. My parents didn't vote, and yet they complained all the time. So I really didn't want to be that person who was complaining but didn't take responsibility to vote. Not that I didn't love my parents, but I always thought it was wrong of them to complain if they didn't vote. So I wasn't going to be like that. And I've always taken my vote very seriously. And I've always had trouble casting my ballot up till and including the last election, and I'm figuring I'm going to face barriers at the next election. So I've worked on a lot of issues, like I worked on the 1985, voting for the handicapped and elderly bill or something like that. I can't remember exactly the name of it, but it was a bill that passed in Congress, and then we passed a comparable bill in Idaho, which I worked on and have lived it most of my life in Idaho. I worked on the Help America Vote Act committee in Idaho, and we had what I thought in Idaho was a really good system. You had same-day registration. You could register and vote the same day. We had ballot marking devices at every polling place. Most polling places were accessible. So anyway, I thought we were doing a pretty good job. But then I moved to Virginia, and I found a lot more barriers in Virginia than we had in Idaho, actually, which is kind of interesting for me. But so I've done a lot of work around this. And in Idaho, even back over a decade ago, I really thought that we should be taking better advantage of voting technology. I thought we should be able to actually back then go back into our study, open up our computer, and vote online, because that's going to make it so much more accessible to a lot of people. Of course, there are those who think that that opens up all kinds of ways for your vote to be hacked and causes security problems. But for people with disabilities, our vote isn't secure now. If you have to have somebody else help you fill out the ballot, or if you run into problems casting your ballot, or what I run into quite frequently is the accessible voting machine is out in the open with no barrier around it. So when I'm casting my vote, like almost anyone can stand over my shoulder and watch who I'm voting for. So there's no privacy. So essentially, our votes are not secure now because of the stuff that we run into. I believe that we could make them even more secure through technology that's available today. We do all of our banking online right now. We're willing to risk our money to being hacked, but apparently voting is somehow open to more hacking than our money is. So with that, I just think that there is so much room for us to improve through technologies the way that people vote, and I think we can make them even more secure that way. So I don't think this is a debate between your vote being secure and your vote being accessible, one versus the other. I really do think they're the same, and we need to find common ground and move forward. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Diane.
Good morning. Oh, what a lovely response. I'm so pleased. You guys must have been good students. So I was asked to talk specifically about a couple of issues. One is the Technical Guidelines Development Committee and the new VVSG 2.0 that is making its way through the cumbersome approval process through multiple committees, et cetera. And then to talk a little bit about the more fitting topic, emerging technologies, and a little bit about the LA County system development prototype, et cetera. Is anybody here from LA? Because I don't want to step on toes as if I'm the expert. Okay, so I'm going to tell if folks in LA County are listening, I am going to do my best, and it'll be a high level, and anyway, so I hope I don't tread on any toes here. So the VVSG has moved out of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, and for any of you who serve on the TGDC, I know there's some other folks here, there has been a long-standing tension between accessibility and security. I am not saying anything new to anyone, and I will say this right up front. I'm an accessibility person. I am not a security person. I say that up front. I acknowledge completely, folks, accessibility people, you are the experts. What I would request is you folks in accessibility quit assuming you know anything about accessibility. And the approach of, oh, as long as it's secure, then, you know, we can make paper accessible. I hate to tell you, but I've been around for a long time, and paper is inaccessible, period. You cannot make paper accessible. It has to be converted into something else if it's actually going to be accessible. So the whole rub between security and accessibility is if the only way you can deliver security is through a marked paper ballot, then you have to acknowledge that it has to be done a different way for accessibility. So the real concern and conflict here is you have to have a digital interface to provide accessibility, and if security people continue to say any digital interface is insecure, then you have essentially said, I cannot provide accessibility. And that is where the statement about the compromise, I mean, at some point, you have to be able to as a security person, say, this digital is secure enough. Accessibility is important enough that this digital interface is allowable and appropriate within the voting process. And we are still struggling with that to this day, unfortunately. So as far as the VVSG 2.0 goes, there are a number of new security requirements, and there are clearer, I hope, accessibility requirements that get us to the point where it's understood what is actually needed in the way of access features in that digital interface. So there's audio tactile, there's enlarged visual display, there's alternative means of input and output, that sort of thing. But again, the problem is that requires an electronic digital interface, and if that is only one machine in a corner in a segregated way where no one in the polling place knows how to turn it on and use it, it produces a ballot that looks different, is counted separately, then we have segregated voting that's not accessible still. And it's not private, it's not independent. So somehow we've got to get to some middle ground here that acknowledges the need for those digital interfaces at a level that truly gives us what Commissioner McCormick described as integrated, seamless voting for people with disabilities. Or, as Kelly pointed out, security means nothing. Your vote is not secure if it's not private and independent anyway. So, all of the concerns about digital accessibility kind of go out the window. So very briefly, LA County really invested a whole lot of time, energy, resources, money in developing a digital interface that provided universal accessibility and language accessibility, another major issue in LA County, multiple languages you have to address out there. So an accessible digital interface that all voters would use, most voters at least, to provide as integrated a voting process as possible. And they tried to solve all the really challenging accessibility problems with paper ballot verification and casting, with automatic feed mechanisms, et cetera, and they are moving forward deploying this. Unfortunately, if you watch the recent Today Show segment, they are getting terrible criticism from the security people. And the basic statement, again, is hand-marked paper is the only thing that's secure. And if you watch that Today Show segment, the security expert that they had on there made a statement that I think actually personifies the perception, which is that people with disabilities need reasonable accommodations, but to say that we all have to adopt insecure technology that puts the entire election at risk can't be either the place or the price of accessibility. I don't know what he said. It was either place or price. Either one's not good in my mind. But at least I'm saying he's acknowledging that, in his opinion, security is more important than accessibility, period. So as a country, we've got to decide, is it or is it not? And if it isn't, then we've got to actually commit to doing the right thing and making it both accessible and secure. Not secure first, and then as accessible as we can make it, as long as it's secure.
Amazing.
Hello. Alice?
Okay, good morning. From an election official's perspective, the DC Board of Elections, I want to start from the perspective that in order for the elections to be accessible to voters with disabilities, we have to start on election day and at the early voting process with the poll workers. If the poll workers are not doing what they need to do to ensure that the systems are available for individuals with disabilities, that they know what they need to do in order to make certain that the barriers are not in a way that prevents individuals who need access, then that creates a problem. So what do? We train our poll workers. We start with training the poll workers in the beginning of our training to be focused on this. And I want to take a minute and recognize, I think Tarika Jennings is here. She is our ADA coordinator and attorney for disability. Tarika, are you here? Tarika? She just stepped out. Okay, I want to recognize her because she has done a yeoman's job with our ADA process. And so we have early voting, we have election day, and we have our web content accessibility guidelines. All of these things are very important. All of these things require an accessible process. So we work diligently to ensure that the accessibility of the voting process is accessible, especially for people with disabilities. This year, for the first time, we will have an accessible electronic ballot for absentee voting. Our voter registration process, there's assistance throughout the whole process in the precinct on election day. We also have what we call our ADA coordinator, ADA assistants, someone in the precinct. In each precinct, we have someone, ADA assistance person, who is there throughout the whole day to help and make certain, for example, that leaves are moved out of the way, that the door is always open, that someone can open the door. If someone needs help, there's someone there that can help them. Obviously, the alternative voting options, such as curbside voting. If someone has to vote at a precinct that is not accessible in the District of Columbia, they can request that their ballot be placed at a precinct that is accessible. They can do that in any mechanism that they have available. They don't have to be in writing. They can call. They can have someone request it on their own behalf. Any way that they can do it, any alternative format that they can use, we can get that there for them. We have an election day hotline. We also have a lot going on with language access and services. American Sign Language interpreters are available at all of our designated polling sites. We provide language access services for voters who are limited or non-English proficiency. That is just as important as the physical disability is the language access, and we pay a lot of attention to that as well. So there are a number of different things that we do, that we use, that we utilize to make certain that every aspect is focused on and made available. Our website, we've worked very closely this year with with BEGA, which is the government Board of Ethics in Government. And that office is the office that assures open government. So what we have done is work closely with them to make sure that the website meets all of the guidelines that it needs to for accessibility. All of our pictures and everything have the taglines on there that it needs to, so that individuals can go through and make certain that they are able to understand and go through it and deal with it as they need to from an accessibility aspect. So we take this very seriously from an operational perspective. And again, I want to emphasize that it is the poll workers on election day and during early voting that must make certain, and we must work with them to make sure that they operate the precinct as they need to on election day to ensure that the equipment is set up, that it is available, everything that is in place, it needs to be in place, and that it's not hidden or not available, and everything that needs to be there is there for anyone who needs to have access to it.
Thank you, Alice. And I want to thank the panelists, before I get to Matt, for all staying on time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Message received. Tom
Tom likes to remind me that the EAC has the shot clock because of me. And so I will stay on time. I'll try to be brief. I want to thank the commissioners for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm not Jeff Hale. He's smarter and taller than I am. And I appreciate the panelists going on the fly on this. I will say, before I get into some opening thoughts, I've had the privilege of working with most of the folks on the panel, and specifically Diane, when I was a member of the TGDC and then when I was DFO of the TGDC, and no one has challenged me more to think about these things, to challenge me to take into account that I'm not an accessibility expert in any way, and made me better at understanding these issues. And no one's done more in the grind of the standards development process than Diane Golden to advance the cause of accessibility in the work with VVSG 2.0. And so I appreciate everything you've done. You've hung in there on this quest. And I'll say that the next version of the VVSG and the EAC has taken some significant steps towards that. Really, I think, strikes that balance, and perhaps most significantly, and I'd encourage anyone to check this out, is they passed a resolution as part of VVSG 2.0 that Diane and David Wagner, who's a security expert from California, co-sponsored as a commitment that the process has to be secure and accessible, that it's not trade-offs to say one over the other, but in fact, the requirement for voters is both. And so we have to find a way to work together to do that. And Diane and David's leadership on that, I think, was significant. A couple of opening thoughts. One is I thought I'd show up and there'd be a dunk tank for me on the accessibility panel, so I appreciate that not taking place. As Kelly and Diane and Alice were speaking, I could not agree more that it's not a debate between the two, that accessibility is security. As we look at risk management from the perspective of CISA and cybersecurity, exactly what Kelly said is how we evaluate the security risk here. Privacy and independence is a security question as much as it is an accessibility question. If you can't vote privately and independently, it is not a secure process. And so the good work that election officials, that the private sector are doing to explore what that looks like is important. And what we've seen, and I think the LA County project speaks to this, is the ability to provide flexibility and options across the process. So we talk a lot about the voting machines, and understandably, but finding ways to do things when you're upgrading your website to be more secure, are you also upgrading your website to be more accessible, to better serve voters so that they can get to the information they need so that they're empowered and able to vote. And how are we looking to make even the verification process or the auditing process more accessible? Voters with disabilities want to know their votes secure just as much as voters that don't have disabilities. They want to know that the process can be audited and that votes are counted as cast just as much as everybody else. And so how are we offering them access to the process beyond just voting so that they can have that level of comfort in moving forward with the process? And then understanding and managing the risks that we introduce. And so Kelly raised the common thought around, if I can bank online, why can't I vote online? And there are fundamental differences, including privacy and independence, which we've talked about. The reality is in banking, it's not only not private, you want to know every transaction and you want the bank to know who you are and what your transactions are, whereas privacy and independence in this case is critical to the process, both from a security and accessibility standpoint. And so there are fundamental challenges and differences that privacy and independence introduces from a security standpoint and an accessibility standpoint as we look at balancing that out. And so I think as we look at options, as we look at improving access and securing the process, it's incumbent on all of us, without question, the security community, to ask ourselves, what impact does lack of accessibility have? A vote, as Doug eloquently said, a vote not cast because someone didn't have access to the process, or a vote cast that doesn't adequately capture the intent of the voter is a security problem that can't be accepted. And so what steps are we taking, not just to worry about the overall cybersecurity best practices, but understanding what impact availability, access to the ballot, the ability to interact with the ballot has? Because the reality is the vast majority of voters that benefit from accessible technology, whether it's in the registration process, the voting process, or otherwise, don't identify themselves as disabled, but get a whole heck of a lot of benefit out of things like more accessible websites or ballot marking devices or screen enlargement or items like that. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Before I turn it over for questions, I just want to, I always go back to the one example that when we were first recommissioned, we went up to Boston for a forum at Suffolk Law School. And one of the gentlemen who was in a wheelchair gave us an example of technology and innovation that occurs that benefits a lot of other people. And that was basically the curb cuts. Basically how curb cuts were put in to allow for folks who have disabilities to be able to access sidewalks and so forth. But we all use it when we bring our, luggage through airports or things like that as well. But no one really thinks about it. So it's things like that that we should be thinking about in terms of moving forward with technology and innovation to ensure that those who have disabilities have access, but also that it benefits all of us. So with that, Kelly, you talked a little bit about your first vote and back in the early 70s and some of the barriers that you faced. But can you tell us a few more of the barriers that people with disabilities encounter in the voting process, and how can technology help to promote progress in that?
Sure. Thanks, Commissioner Hicks. Well, I think we face barriers from the very beginning, like the websites where you get your information. A lot of those are inaccessible. I don't know how many were watching when the presidential the campaigns started, but all of their websites were inaccessible. And I ran for the state Senate and the House of Representatives in Idaho, and as a candidate, and as somebody who worked on campaigns, the campaigns are inaccessible. Like most of the fundraising stuff that's held, most of the campaign meetings are held at inaccessible spots. Their information is inaccessible, and the voting registration process is a lot like that, and getting voter information about your candidates is a lot like that. You face all those barriers to get that information, and then the voting process itself is a lot of times inaccessible to even, some of the ones I mentioned was like when you go to cast your ballot, even getting into some of the polling places is a problem. And then when you get there, registering and finding somebody who, like Diane mentioned, finding somebody who knows where the accessible voting machine is, and finding somebody who knows how to turn it on and set it up, and all of that. You run into all of those kinds of issues. And then, so I do think technology could address a lot of that, and I understand the fundamental differences between banking and voting, but my point was, if we can figure one out, we should be able to figure the other one out. Technologies should be able to be developed, we're smart enough to do this, that are secure and provide more accessibility. But one thing I do want to just make a comment about is, I don't think we can just think that technology is the panacea either. A lot of people with disabilities, technologies actually create barriers for them. So we need to keep those kinds of things in mind and make sure that the voting process is easy to understand for people who have a hard time reading text or reading complicated stuff, and make sure that it then is accessible physically as well. So we have to think about both of those things, especially as we're developing new technologies. We need to bake that in at the beginning, not try to fix it later on. So,
thank you. Diane, you are on the TGDC and talked a little bit about some of the barriers that were faced in terms of the debate on security versus accessibility. Can you tell us a little bit about recent accomplishments from the TGDC? And I understand that you were involved with the LA County new accessible machine, and I know it's about 7:15 in the morning out there. So they're probably not up or so. But can you tell us a little bit about that new technology?
Sure. Sorry.
I got you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm a tech person. Great. Not turn the mic on. So the TGDC, like I said before, did just finish their work on VVSG 2.0, and again, there's new security requirements and there's new accessibility requirements, but a lot of clarification of prior accessibility requirements that were never quite understood. So there's good things on both sides of the scale. If you're looking at Lady Liberty, and the scales of justice kind of thing, the standards themselves are relatively balanced. The concern on my part and what was sort of hanging up the process, quite frankly, was the fact that those two sets of standards were not necessarily going to prevent segregated voting, to just be quite frank. I mean, you can have great accessibility requirements and great security requirements, but if those are implemented where everyone is hand marking a paper ballot and there's one segregated machine, that is going to be difficult no matter how many times you train poll workers. If it's segregated, and if it produces a ballot that looks different, is printed differently, is counted separately, that is not accessible nor secure in my mind, and it's literally segregated voting. So we were wrestling with how to address that in a set of standards, and we did that through introductory text that basically said, one segregated ballot marking device is not appropriate. I mean, point blank. Now, what is? Obviously, the LA County approach is everybody, or the universal way of casting a ballot, marking, verifying, and casting a ballot is through a digital interface. So everyone's using a digital interface to mark a ballot, so everybody's ballots look the same and are counted the same way. That's obviously on the other extreme. Everybody's digitally interacting. Everybody's hand marking paper over here. The question is, what's acceptable in the middle? I don't know. But that's going to be a question election officials are going to need to wrestle with and decide what's acceptable. Like I said, the LA County approach is to have a system that everyone uses that has a lot of universal design features, a lot of adaptations for language differences, et cetera. Everybody's interacting digitally, marking a paper ballot, verifying it via that digital interface, casting it. There's automatic paper handling. And again, I give them kudos for doing their level best to address all of the accessibility issues with the understanding that it's still a marked paper ballot for security purposes at the end of the day. Unfortunately, they're coming under a lot of criticism from security folks again. So, my plea is, I'm back to what everybody said, this is an acknowledgement of both. It's not an either or, and until the security side of things actually gets on board with it's not an either or, we're just going to, I think, continue to fight this battle of the preference for everybody to hand mark paper and accessibility being not a baked in from the start, not an integrated part, but a segregated something we have to do as an accommodation on the side. So,
Can I just quickly, I think Diane's done a good job laying out the LA County trade-off. But a key part for them from both a security and accessibility part is every voter's offered the option to vote a paper ballot at home as well. So if you're worried about the security of the system or you benefit from having more time at home with the ballot to understand what's on there, you can get a mail ballot, mark it by hand and return it if that's what you prefer, or it buys you. So I forget the percentage, but 60, 70% or more of voters in LA County are going to vote on a hand-marked paper ballot through the mail because that's what they've chosen to do, both either because of access, security, or it's just what they want conveniently, or they can interact in person. And so it's striking that balance that way too.
And I've got to give LA County another kudo. They also have a blank ballot delivery option, where you can get your ballot digitally delivered to you. You can mark it for people with disabilities, particularly significant disabilities. If I am someone who is deafblind and I'm using refreshable Braille, nobody's going to build a voting machine that, has a refreshable Braille display built into it. That allows me to mark my ballot privately and independently using my own assistive technology at home. I store a QR code. I roll in someplace, walk in someplace, scan my QR code. It prints my ballot. I can cast it hands-free. I can verify it. We're off to the races. That sort of thing, again, not only do they have the hand mark a paper ballot at home option, they have, I don't remember what they call it. They call this thing something. But it's the multiple options, multiple ways available to everyone, and that's the truly ubiquitously accessible and hopefully secure enough. It's all about the level of risk you're willing to take, and if you're willing to take zero risk, then I mean, hand-marked paper doesn't have zero risk, but apparently that's what a lot of security people think. So,
Okay. Alice, you talked a little bit about ways to have a ballot delivered to those who have disabilities, and then talked a little bit about the facilities that may be in the district that might not be accessible. Can you talk a little bit more about how those places that are not accessible for folks to still be able to receive their ballots and cast their ballots independently and privately?
Yeah, sure. As I indicated, this year, for example, for the first time, we will have an accessible electronic absentee voting platform so that anyone who wants to vote absentee will be able to do that through an accessible platform at home. It's an audio platform, I believe, that we'll just be implementing this year. Also, anyone can vote. Anyone can vote absentee, no excuse absentee voting at home. We don't need an excuse, just request your ballot. We also have, as always, curbside voting. There's large print. If anyone needs a large print ballot, we can get that for them. There's magnifying glasses at every precinct. Anyone who needs voter assistance, we have that available in every precinct throughout the District of Columbia. And I just want to touch a little bit, pick up on what Doug touched on, and that was the Accessible Voting Technology Initiative, that the grants that were given out by Congress in 2009 and 2010, and the fact that the R&D, the research and development that was done through those grants. I think there were about 45 initiatives that came out through those grants, and a lot of the technology that was developed with those grants is now being put in place through the time that came through with those grants. And I know Juan is here, but the Prime 3 is one of the things that came out, was developed even more with that grant. And just speaking with him this morning, he indicated to me that ES&S, their Express Vote, is Prime 3 was the foundation for that, which I did not know. Prime 3 is the foundation in which ES&S uses the Express Vote. So with that in mind, technology continues to be developed, and with the use of grants and continuation of grants, obviously the continual development of technology and the use of ballots and how we do these things to make it accessible for voters becomes more and more important. And those are the kind of things we need to look to try to develop and become more and more creative with.
Great, thank you. Matt, as election officials work to meet the accessibility promise of HAVA, can you talk about the heightened importance of security in today's election landscape, along with the importance to have access for people with disabilities?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, I think from traveling the country, meeting with election officials, the 2016 election, the impact it's had on the overall awareness around cybersecurity, the need to secure systems, and really the goal is to manage the risks, right? That there's no such thing as perfect security, and so how do we balance and allow the process to maintain integrity even if something happens, right? How do we build resilience in the process? And that includes being able to continue to serve voters, provide not just the required level, but the expected level of access for voters. And I think a couple points raised by Kelly, Diane, and Alice are really important to talk about because we focus so much on the technology. And I think Kelly's point about technology not being able to solve all the problems is exactly right. And if you look at Alice's point about the role of poll workers, right? You're talking about a group of people that you have limited time to train, limited time to familiarize them with technology, which can be a security challenge, and is certainly, we've seen in practice, a major accessibility challenge. And so how can we as a community working together look at technological standards, look at technological approaches to make it easier for those poll workers to serve those voters and create better access, whether that's through systems that are easier to implement, systems that allow for more options like curbside voting, right? That, having seen what some jurisdictions have to do to log those systems out, lug them out to the curbside and serve those voters. There's better approaches that don't involve introducing more security risk. In fact, it probably involves just simplifying the process in a lot of ways to be able to help support those poll workers that spend very little time with the technology and are asked to do a lot, whether it's from securing the technology. That's the irony. The poll workers are asked to both secure the technology and make it accessible on limited training and support. And so I think we can do a lot to improve that. And then Kelly's point around the other peripheral systems that we use, making e-poll books accessible, right? That's a security challenge that we can continue to work on because if you can't check in, if you're pushed away from the process because it's cumbersome or hard, that's not acceptable. Or website accessibility. Again, as you're investing to upgrade your website security-wise, you should be investing to make it more accessible for everyone, not just voters with disabilities. And so I think we have lots of opportunity for improvement where it's not a question of balancing security and accessibility. It's literally, while you're in improving your systems, what can you be doing to both secure the system and make it more accessible, because they interplay together completely. And so I think as we see the new HAVA grants go out, as we see people invest, I would love to see coordinated thought around what steps are we taking to secure the process and what more can we be doing while we're touching that system to create better accessibility.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I want to invite questions from the audience. Doug is going to help facilitate this, and again, identify yourself, wait for the microphone because this is being live streamed, and please ask a question.
All right. Wonderful. Also, I want to point out we've got a couple other folks from the EAC here. If you all would just raise your hands, I'll make sure that we get the mics to you. Real quick, and I'm not asking anybody to answer this, but just a couple of things that occur to me as I hear this that folks are welcome to address or ignore, like my students often do. One is I like Kelly's idea that this isn't an issue of security versus accessibility, but actually almost an issue of segregation. How much segregation are we willing to tolerate, and if so, how are we going to implement and fund that? The other, based on what I'm hearing Matt and others say, this new federal money that's available, either the 18 wave or the latest wave, to what extent are we using accessibility as one of the things about which we are going to secure the election process? And with that, I'm going to don my mythical red glasses and come right back here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Maya Bella. I'm with the Arizona Center for Disability Law. We're the protection and advocacy system for the state of Arizona. And I had a question I was hoping to just open for the discussion, and that is that, the latest round of HAVA fundings back in 2018, we petitioned hard to get our Secretary of State to utilize some of those funds for accessibility concerns, consider those sorts of things. In the end, the security kind of won out on that. And I was hoping you have ideas, recommendations for how we engage our local election officials that are making these decisions about which new technologies to invest in for elections, thoughts about how we can get them to understand that this is not necessarily diametrically opposed, security versus accessibility, that those two things can be considered together.
It's all you, panel.
Well, I'll say that we are actually using our 2018 money to utilize it for the accessible absentee electronic voting platform. So that's one way that we're using our money for the for accessibility. It just made sense to do it for that. I mean, there's some things going toward security. That, yes. I like that. Forgot about that. Security as well, but yes, accessibility was just as important in our minds as well.
The only thing I'll say, election officials rightfully, it's an extremely resource limited, right, area. And so as they're making decisions on investment, those places, again, where investment so if you're buying a new server, there's very little, and that's needed in many places, right? There's very little accessibility implication to that. But as you're looking at your website, as you're looking at improvements to what voters interact with and interface with, looking at systems that thought about accessibility and security from the design stage should be part of the procurement process, right? It's not just one or the other. It's holistically, how does whatever vendor you're working with or anyone else, how did they view both the access and security challenges of whatever system's being provided, and how can you invest in something that supports that? Because a lack of access is essentially a denial of service, right? And so with those systems that folks interact with, it's not just about having something that's super secure, but it's also about having something that people can actually use to register to vote or whatever the system's doing, right? And then the other part of it for me is, again, goes back to whether it's the folks at the local election office or really the poll workers. When you're investing or training on, investing in additional training around how to secure the system is also an investment on training time about how to provide access, right? And so we see a lot of people doing things like tabletops and training for their poll workers or officials. Incorporating questions around access into that conversation is wholly appropriate. It doesn't only need to be about malware present on a system, but talking about overall how that could play out.
Yeah, I would just echo the comment about there's already a lot of things that you could do in regards to training people to make the whole thing more accessible. There's a lot of this stuff that's decisions that are made as you put an election together. So make sure that when you're putting it together accessible, and you're doing training to people so that we're not segregated off, or that the machines aren't set up, all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of things you can take care of just through training, and you should do that. But also, just want to remind everybody, it's not an option. I mean, my vote is guaranteed, and it's a civil right to me under several laws, right? Not just one. It's not just HAVA. There is a number of laws that guarantee me the right to vote and the right to an accessible and private vote. So it's not like an option. You can't choose not to do it. It's really something you are obligated under law to do, and I would just remind them of that. So.
And I'll just add one last thing, which is, and Kelly's channeling me, I mean, and Matt I said this over and over and over again at TGDC meetings, accessibility is a legal mandate. We're not talking about it's the right thing to do. We're not talking about it's a good idea. It's the it's a mandatory thing. And yet, for whatever reason, the press coverage, everything is focused on security. I guess it's glitzier, it's more, I don't know, popular, but every press article is going to be about security. It's not going to be about accessibility, and we can't, for whatever reason, we can't seem to raise the level of understanding within the press corps or within the general population. So until we do, I think we're just going to keep battling this focus on security, which ends up then frequently unintentionally harming accessibility. So I don't know how we change the dynamic so that it isn't the focus where it's been.
So what I'm hearing as a takeaway while I'm waiting for more folks to put up their hands for questions is that whether it's directives from the federal level or awareness among the election community, we need to understand that accessibility is a necessary included part of this idea of security and act accordingly.
Can I say just real quick while you're walking with the mic, you're doing a great Phil Donahue, which is a dated reference, but I'm old enough. Investment in things, and I'll give a specific example, but there are others. In something like Windows 10, that's a security investment, but there's improved accessibility in that operating system as well, right? So understanding that that's an improvement not just to the security of the system and a critical one, but to the accessibility of the system. That's a really good pickup for election officials. Yep.
Hi, my name's Tate Fall, and I'm with the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program, so the Alabama P&A. My question's for Alice. So I would say the majority of the issues that we have in Alabama does boil down to lack of poll worker training, but in Alabama, poll worker training is not required. Only the election judges have to go to training. And in addition to that, curbside voting is illegal per our Secretary of State. So how would you suggest that us advocates try to help these poll workers and educate them, especially when it comes down to using the auto mark or the express vote?
That's difficult because our poll workers are required to have a minimum of 4 hours of training before they can work in the precinct on election day. We got it through legislation. So that may be an avenue you may want to go through as your legislators to get it in the law. So through law, they have to have training, and without training, they cannot work in the precinct on election day. So that might be a way to do it.
Anybody else on the panel?
Change the law.
Good. All right. Diane, I do want to thank you for using the word darn. I imagine you said something stronger in the meeting.
I can confirm she did.
Speaking of something stronger, gentleman in the back.
I'm Jim Dixon, the National Council on Independent Living. I would like Alice and others on the panel to address this myth that paper ballots are secure and accurate. It's magical thinking on the part of computer geeks who say, oh, hand mark, super safe. Could you just tell a couple of stories about how paper ballots and the whole question of voter intent complicate, make elections insecure and difficult to do?
We don't want to put Alice on the spot like that, Jim, but I would just highlight Florida 2000, that was,
There you go.
which was mostly about ballot design and the inaccuracy of counting ballots. I would say that we've come a long way in those 20 years, and I would say that we can go a little bit further. But that's the point that I would make of ballot design and inaccurate counting of ballots.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to add, and I've said this to other people, I also, voting is not my primary work genre. This has been a volunteer side effort for the last 20 or so years that I've been doing this. And I work in, obviously, assistive technology and spend a lot of time in the K-12 education sphere, higher ed, college. And this issue of security and accessibility comes up in high-stakes testing, the LSAT, the GRE, the ACT, high school exams, all of that sort of stuff. And this goes to Jim Dixon's question, and all of those have moved to digital interfaces because of the problems with people trying to color in dots on the hand mark thing, and it's not voter intent, it's student intent, and the counting systems, if there's a missed mark or the paper, or the students drinking coffee and it splashes on it, you have all of these issues, and those are high stakes things. Somebody getting admitted to law school, getting admitted to whatever college, and And the accessibility issues of those digital interfaces, we've had to work through the balancing of security and accessibility, and we've made really, really great progress. So all that is to say is, yes, other folks have realized that hand-marked paper is not terribly secure or accurate in a lot of ways, and they have moved to digital in other environments and have balanced the two issues. So, I'll hold out hope that maybe in the voting environment we can pull this off at some point also.
So I would say for DC, in all of our precincts, we offer both a traditional paper ballot and a ballot marking device. Voters have an option. They can choose whichever they want in both early voting and on election day. If we had more ballot marking devices on election day, I'm sure there would be more individuals choosing that. For early voting, there's no question more voters obviously float to the ballot marking device. There's not even an issue about it. They generally love the ballot marking device. It's easier, it's quicker, it's a lot simpler to use. Choices are easier to select. You don't have to, we don't have a problem with voter intent with that. It's just very easy to do. So we will be able, obviously, to purchase more equipment with the money that we have now. So we'll be able to increase the number of BMDs that we put in the precinct. So with that, I think voters generally like the BMDs more so than the traditional paper, but we offer both.
And two things. Thing one, the next panel, we'll talk more about ballot marking devices. Thing two, as someone who works with the University of Minnesota just on the subject of paper ballots, I'd be remiss if I did not say the two words lizard people.
I'm Essie Peterson, and I'm with Self Advocates Becoming Empowered. And I have more of a comment and a suggestion. We, every other year, we survey our membership and people with developmental disabilities. And one of the things that comes up very high is poll workers. And, we've been talking about that. And I would just like to reinforce the importance of training our poll workers. I am a poll worker. I've been a poll worker for 10 years. Every time I go through that darn training, I try to talk about people with disabilities and how to make things accessible. And I am not nicely told to be quiet, that we're not discussing that. So the doors aren't really open for that. But what I'd like to talk about now is that we have learned a great deal that people cannot understand the ballots. I mean, we're talking about the technology, but as we do the technology, we need to look at the information that's going on there at the same time. I know we're going to be talking about ballots more, but I think the technology design needs to be sensitive to how that's laid out and how that looks and how you present it to people. Thank you.
And I'll go ahead and add a question to that. To what extent, Matt, I know more and more we're seeing security officials suggesting that one way to secure the process is for more people to participate as poll workers. I'd be curious about what you and the panel think about opportunities and imperatives for folks with disabilities to participate in the process, not just as voters, but as poll workers or other election assistants.
Yeah, this is a topic that's, when I was at the EAC, was one that finding voters with disabilities and empowering them to serve not just as poll workers, but again, they're just as worried about the security of their vote as every other citizen. And so whether it's the ability to participate and engage with pre-election testing, post-election auditing, the count process, it's critically, but that access has to be available throughout the process, not just, in the voting process itself. And so I know there's a long time challenge. Folks across the country, Jim and Diane, have pushed for things like greater access with electronic poll books, but also just greater representation throughout the process in whether it's serving as a poll worker or otherwise, because it matters. It helps voters understand that their perspective is valued and taken into account, and it improves the overall accessibility because they ask questions and challenge in a way that I certainly wouldn't, right? And so I think it's critically important.
And I will just add, every time I do a presentation on voting, which seems like it's pretty frequent, no matter who the group is, I tell everybody in there, go sign up to be a poll worker. Whether I'm talking to a group of occupational therapy students, or I'm talking to a bunch of assistive technology people, or I'm talking to, doesn't matter, people with disabilities. Every one of you, if you know something about accessibility, then you need to volunteer to be a poll worker, because they need people who understand accessibility. And I've actually had a few people follow up with me and say, someone in Florida, I was just at Assistive Technology Industry Association, did a session on voting, and there's I think she's an occupational therapist in Florida who's signing up to be a poll worker in her local jurisdiction. For every one of those people, that's a step forward.
And I would just say quickly, we work very closely with the Office of Disability Rights, and we do have a number of poll workers who are individuals that classify as in that category. We try to recruit them. We put them in our precincts, and that's a visible. They're very visible in our precincts in the District of Columbia, and we work very closely to recruit and to have them there.
And one final, I'm sorry, it came to me as Alice was talking, and it's something Diane drove home during the TGDC process. A lot of times, voters with disabilities are more tech savvy than your typical poll worker, because they've been forced to interact and use technology in a variety of ways in their lives. And so I know from talking to many election officials that have voters with disabilities either serve on advisory councils or serve as poll workers, that they're very, in many cases, extremely tech savvy and can offer a lot of guidance and advice on the use of and engagement with technology, which I think is really useful.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left, so I'm going to enforce a lightning round. If you could be brief in your question and also brief in the answers from the panel.
Hi, I'm Sachin Pavithran with the U.S. Access Board. Appreciate all the comments that has been made so far. One of the barriers that I've seen as a person with a disability, as a blind person, especially in rural areas, transportation is one of the biggest barrier to get for folks to get to polling places. And that continues to be a problem, not just in rural areas, in most places. So solutions to be able to vote independently when transportation is a barrier, I would think options like mobile voting is a critical component. And when we talk about that option, security folks don't tend to get too excited about it. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
This is Diane Golden, obviously, and agree, and that's the beauty of remote or any kind of the whole early voting, remote voting, whether it's remote ballot marking or it's blank ballot delivery, all of those sorts of things. And I know that's a topic for an upcoming panel that's going to be talking more specifically about those options. And yes, but you're right. I know we've harped on this, but it's literally everything we tend to throw out that is going to increase accessibility. We get the pushback from the security folks and remote voting systems. Yes, there's, if you breathe the word digital on the internet, it's like a no-go from the beginning. So yeah, and we have to find some balance, because that's my example of people who are deafblind. They absolutely, no matter what we build into a voting machine at the polling place, it's not going to likely work. Or somebody who's using, an eye gaze system. Okay, they're going to have to use their own technology to mark a ballot. There's no other way around it. So we've got to have remote options that the security people will accept.
Yeah, this is Kelly. I'll just weigh in real quick. I was at a meeting along with Michelle Bishop out here in the audience just last week, where we were talking about with some senators' staff about voting and security, this very topic, and this came up, and like the only way to address it, versus what we're talking about in regards to early voting and ballot delivery and those some sort of technology so that people can vote remotely, would be to mandate transportation for everybody in every part of the country, which obviously isn't going to happen. And a lot of the transportation systems aren't accessible anyway, so really we have to figure this out through some other means, like what we're talking about, early voting, ballot delivery, some sort of technology where you can vote remotely, that sort of stuff. And the Votes app is one thing to look at in regards to that. So, transportation is a big problem for a lot of people with disabilities, and so we got to figure this out.
And this is Doug borrowing Kelly's mic to give the birthday boy the last word.
At age 74, I'm just about old enough to become a poll worker, so I'm, For those of you that represent disability organizations, be sure to go back and read the Help America Vote Act. There is a little-known provision in it that says if any additional federal funds are appropriated to buy voting equipment, that every piece of voting equipment that is purchased must be accessible. Not just one per precinct, but every system has to have accessibility. Now, that's never been tested in the courts, and obviously it's going to take somebody probably trying to enforce that in order for it to take an impact. But so those of you that represent accessibility organizations, read that. Get with your lawyers. Try to figure out what you think can be done, because the truth is the system should be that they can pick any one of the systems in the precinct to vote on and have other voters also voting on it so that there can be privacy and independence.
Commissioner, it's all you.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Doug. I would like to highlight an EAC tool which incorporates both accessibility and technology. In 2016, we created the voting rights card in one universal accessible pamphlet presenting the information in Braille, which I don't have up here with me today, in large print and plain language, but we have it out at the booth outside. But on the back of here has a QR code, and I just tried it to make sure that it still was working correctly. To date, the EAC has distributed thousands of these well-received cards, and plans to give out more of these cards before the November election. And I always carry this around with me. So, one other thing that I wanted to highlight is that Diane brought up some very bad memories for me, because I remember taking the SAT and knowing that I should be at an Ivy League school, but the scores did not come back correctly. And I think that's because of my marking of those SATs. Yeah, exactly. But I would like to thank all of the panelists for their tremendous contributions in helping discuss the private and independent vote for people with disabilities. And please join with me in thanking them. We look forward to our continued work together as we call upon innovative solutions to further assist voters with disabilities and the election officials who serve them. With this, I am going to, we can do this